Welcome to the Books Applied podcast, presented by WSL Leadership. In this podcast, we talk about an awesome book and how to apply it to your work, sport, or life. I'm your host, Iggy Perillo. Thanks for joining me. On this episode of the Books Applied podcast, I'm talking about the book Holding Change by Adrienne Maree Brown. The subtitle is The Way of Emergent Strategy, Facilitation, and Mediation. And I am super stoked to be talking with my very special guest, Jayne Nucete, who I've known for a long time. I'm so excited to have you here. Jayne, can you introduce yourself to the people out there listening?
Absolutely. I'm so glad to be here with you. It's really fun to get to have this conversation. And a little bit about me is that I'm a facilitator and trainer, and I work primarily in the space of leadership and conflict resolution and management and racial equity. And sometimes those three strands of my work kind of braid together depending on what's needed. And sometimes they're a little bit more separate. My clients tend to be in either corporations or nonprofits, or sometimes in the public sector. And occasionally I do work with people who are directly engaged in political conflict, although not all the time. And I'm based out in Boston.
Fantastic. How did you come across this book? Do you remember how it found you or how you found it?
I first learned about Adrienne Maree Brown's work when she published Emergent Strategy, and folks that I was meeting through the racial equity facilitation community here in Boston kept bringing it up, and it was very present for folks at the time that it came out. And so I thought, I really need to learn about this and understand what Emergent Strategy is. And it took me a little while because I'm slow to read a book. I'm slow to finally pick it up and read it. I'm quick to acquire it and put it on my bedside table and let it warm up the bedside table for a long time
right.
Before I actually pick it up. And then when I finally did, Emergent Strategy made a ton of sense to me. And then Adrienne Maree Brown came out with this book, which felt like to me how to operationalize emergent strategy for my field, which is facilitation. And I also did mediation in the past. And so this one, I think I learned about this book through her Instagram, but it was really through the community of racial equity facilitation folks that I learned about her, and then really got into the way that she brings together not only her facilitation practice and her movement work, but she connects it to nature, which really resonates with me.
Fantastic. I feel similarly, I learned about Holding Change just because it just kept being referenced and referenced and referenced and referenced by everyone I talked to that's in the facilitation and mediation world. And then I learned backward about Emergent Strategy in that book. I haven't read it yet, but she references a very cool part of that book. By the way, I'm curious about this. We'll start back in time. She talks about the privilege circle activity that she does, which sounds fascinating. I was just at a conference recently discussing the privilege walk. It's sort of this kind of, in my space, a pretty classic tool to help people realize that you're starting from different places, where you have folks on a line and they move forward or back based on different characteristics of privilege or lack of privilege in their lives. And some are chosen, some are not chosen. And she does this whole activity as a circle so that some folks are moving closer and closer to the center, and some people are moving farther and farther from the center. And I think at the end, just reading about it sort of secondhand from herself, quoting herself, it looks like, hey, look at these people in the middle who have been not under-recognized in a lot of spaces. These are the people we need to pay attention to and make sure they get recognition, and we are noticing what is going on with these folks because they've been not recognized in the past. It was my take on that. And I'm like, I should go read Emergent Strategy. That sounds really cool.
I forgot about that example. And I really love it because part of the conversation that was happening at the conference was about how the privilege walk what I've heard people talk about and been in conversation with some folks is how the privilege walk can be really, it can replicate the experience of being alienated or left behind, because oftentimes it's people who live with privileges that are, unassigned, that just come to them, who are taking the steps forward. And so then it just leaves folks feeling like, okay, well, this is a replication of my experience of being left behind, of being left out, right? Folks who experience marginalization already, it's just a repeat. And so a lot of the concern I've heard is, what's the usefulness of that? That's using people's experience to be instructive to those who don't yet understand it. but I love how the circle flips that and is
Mm-hmm.
still pointing out the same issues, but is saying we're actually going to center the experiences of people who have been left out before. And it also creates this like holding, right? If we're in a
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
circle, sure, we might feel like we're on the periphery of a circle, but because it flips the direction, I think it
Mm-hmm.
allows the same perspective taking without reinforcing the pain of having been marginalized.
Right, right. Or
Yeah.
the without like exacerbating the uh harm, like the introspection, the fragile ego introspection of like, oh, but I didn't, but the often the people of privilege, in my experience, are want to justify the reason they're at this space, like the reason that
Right.
they have privilege. Like, well, we worked hard. Like there's this sort of weird justification vibe when you're like, yeah, it's hard to sort of disentangle people from feeling called out sometimes, I guess, in that activity. Either
Mm-hmm.
harmed because we're reinforcing marginalized behavior, like history, or called out in some sense for having privilege, and that is taken very defensively or not as a like opportunity for possibility. Like that becomes things become very closed very quickly, I think, sometimes in that space.
Yeah. And I think even the format of the original exercise, right? It kind of reminds me of like your listeners probably know that you worked for Outward Bound at one point, and I also worked for Outward Bound. That's how we met. And part of the facilitation of that kind of experience is recognizing that conversations only get harder if you're standing in a straight line, right? So, like, if you're trying to move forward with a group, try to get in a circle so you can all see each other, so you can have an actual conversation, so you can at least read the group. And it's like the other move there is this really good facilitation move of like, let's get out of this line stretched across the room and instead into a circle where we can perceive what's happening in the social field. And yeah, it's so interesting that I had forgotten about that example completely, because to me, just that example has so much of the richness of this facilitation guidance that she's offering in Holding Change, to not even speak of the mediation piece,
Right,
which is also
right.
great.
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
yeah, because the other thing I love that she does in this book is she names how facilitation and mediation have a shared lens and how they're distinct and how they're really different processes. And to do them well, you want to pay attention to which phase you're in or which process you're in, and then use the skills and the tools of that process. Because I really loved that, because sometimes when I have this bucket of skills and things that I do in the interpersonal space, it can feel like it gets all mushed together. And like
Right,
it's hard
right.
to tease apart, like, okay, what's the conflict stuff and what's the just helping people through a process? And it all happen concurrently, but I think she does a really nice job of pulling those apart so you can kind of look at what's underneath, and then or what's in between maybe instead of underneath, and then letting it still coexist as a kind of holistic set of skills that you might use in different ways. So that part was super insightful to me. And like, honestly, I read this book first a while ago, like a couple of years ago. The time that it finally sort of came off the bedside table into my full attention was deep winter time, which I've started to love as a time to like wake up really early and read something interesting. And side note, I haven't traditionally been an early bird, so that's a big,
Life
big source,
change. Yeah.
big life change source of joy. And I just remember reading this and it feeling like, oh, yeah, this totally tracks with all of the insights I've had over like decades of facilitation. And then also, wow, I'd never thought of it that way. Like both of those
Right.
experiences at the same time. Like both, oh, this is exactly how I understand it. And oh, I didn't know that, or I didn't get that, or I didn't articulate it in this super brilliant way. Um, and I love that about this book, because when I come back to it, I feel like it is both like a primer on facilitation. Like if I, as a, brand new facilitator, someone had handed this to me, it would have been a great, like, okay, here's the groundwork. But it's also like an advanced meditation text. Like you can go into it and pick some small part and like meditate on how that functions and whether you're doing that piece well or how you're working with it. And then lately, I think of it as a manual. And like I just facilitated a retreat in the spring, and there's some stuff as I was looking at my notes on this book coming into our conversation today, I thought, oh, that was so important for that group. And
Mm-hmm.
so now I look at this book and I'm like, okay, how do I continue to use it as a manual for mundane seeming things like building an agenda, but also the kind of deeper work of how do I show up as a facilitator for this group, as a facilitator that's useful to this group. So it's funny because it's not like a thick book,
No,
but
it's teeny.
really like, yeah, it's like a quick, easy read if you want to geek out about facilitation and mediation, I guess. It
Yeah.
might not be a quick, easy read for everyone, but for me, for
Yeah.
like folks who are interested in this, and it's just like so rich. There's so much there. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm curious about your experience of like when you first picked this up and what was landing for you. And I mean, you talked a little bit about that, or
Yeah.
anything that wasn't, anything that like was not sitting quite right.
Right, right. Well, I think I didn't quite know what to expect when I picked it up first. I'm like, okay, here's how you do some stuff. But I love how the book is organized. There's sort of this little assessment part, like assessing your group and blah, blah, blah. And you're like, okay, great. Yeah, okay, group assessments, whatever. But then there's this beautiful part called Black Feminist Wisdom, which is just like this series of 10 or 15 or I don't know, essays by Black feminists about different types about ideas about facilitation. I really like the ideas. There's a couple sections about creating a brave space, creating braver spaces that I think have been sort of hot topics. And you're like, yeah, I guess that's kind of a buzzwordy thing, but then you get this much more embodied sense of what some of these things mean in a very realistic, deep perspective, like the meditative part that you were talking about that I loved. And then Adrienne Maree Brown goes into a series of chapters about facilitation and mediation and like what they are, what they aren't, like different styles of them, which I guess I'd never really thought of with so much nuance before. I didn't love the difference between facilitation and mediation, and only in that I'm like, whoa, I never facilitate anything apparently. I'm like, oh wait, also I never mediate anything apparently. Like her definitions are very nuanced and specific, and facilitation is about moving the movement forward. And I'm like, oh, I'm called to like help a team do stuff, but I think I also, and maybe sort of downplay the work that I do. I think there's this beautiful line somewhere that I'm never going to find at the my fingertips, unfortunately, about how the worlds we create in a facilitated environment are the worlds we want to create in the bigger environment sometimes. So we're basically creating a model of the world we want to live in the smaller space. I'm like, okay, I can get on board with definitely trying to do that all the time. I think I don't feel like I'm moving a movement forward very often, personally. I mean, even though I'm talking about justice, I'm talking about interactions with people, I'm talking about how to embody values and things like that often in the work I do. So I mean, super nitpicky to be like, your definition didn't align with my definition. I don't care. I'm going to basically, I think there's this other part where I work with folks who want a mediator to be an adjudicator that actually decides who's right and wrong in a conflict. And I think mediation has, in many people's minds, been conflated with adjudication. So, oh wait, we'll go to a mediator. They'll decide who's right and wrong and who gets what and who does what. I'm like, that's not really how a mediator works. But I think that's a common misconception. So I tend to support folks in thinking about, well, let's just find a facilitator to make this conversation easier. Let's find a facilitator. So I tend to lean on the word facilitator more often, correctly or incorrectly in many situations, in that the idea is that the people are going to work together and figure it out, which is actually the definition of mediation. So I'm like, well, okay. So I've just clouded this up for everyone. But I think me and my problem with definitions is like a very personal, small problem. The reality is this book has so many great ideas for how you think about doing mediation, facilitation, different ways this works out. It was really mind expanding for me. And I had the benefit of reading many chapters of this with a small group of people. We would discuss a couple of the Black Feminist Wisdom chapters in particular. And they were great to talk with a group of folks and just get more perspective and deeper into it and into how this matters and affects our work. And in that group, there were small business owners, but also an actual mediator, like professional. And I would say I'm definitely more on the facilitator side, although apparently I help people solve problems. So it's like whatever it is, definitions, don't get hooked by my problem with that. But it was great. It was great to talk through the book and get into this idea, and some of it's super duper practical, right? Like, here's what to do with difficult participants. And it's like, here's one type, here's another type, here's another type. Basically, step by step, some very detailed things, but also mind expanding ideas around, well, what are we doing? What does safety really mean in the group? And she talks about physical safety. She talks about emotional safety in a way that's not just like, okay, make sure everyone can be heard. Check, let's go. You know, this really a much more deep, nuanced approach to things. And it's less than 200 pages long, this whole thing. It's so great.
Yeah. Well, and I just want to name that we're both white women, and
Right.
being able to tap into a lineage, source of like both knowledge that has been captured in the past, but also is emerging now. And like we're having more voice. And this book is one of the ways that that voice is coming into being for Black feminists and for Black women to be able to have a really active space in shaping how we define these roles. That to me is really inspiring, because the alternative is like kind of an outdated old model of sourcing from folks who have tons of privilege, right? And not that their privilege negates the value they might bring, but it does limit, right? It limits the scope and the understanding of all the nuance that might be present in the room. And so I'm also just sitting with that as you name all of the pieces around like definition and that section of Black feminist wisdom is like, I really loved that, both for what the people said. And there was one chapter where somebody talked about not even using the word facilitation because they found that that carried all of these like Western white privilege pieces of baggage. I don't think they use that phrase, but essentially the idea that like your facilitator is your timekeeper and you will produce a specific product at the end. And they wanted to be engaging in a much more emergent way of facilitation that was based on what people brought into the room. And so they called it something else, like strategy support, I think. And that came to mind just now because, you know, as you're like, oh, is it mediation? Is it facilitation? I think part of it too is this naming what we do in a way that people can connect to enough to participate. Right. So it's like if people you're working with are so kind of like stuck on the idea of mediation leading to really what we would call like adjudication, then yeah, call it facilitation, because that's going to allow them to enter into the process that you might think of as mediation. Adrienne Maree Brown might think of as mediation, but if it helps them to have it be called facilitation, then cool.
Yeah. You know? I'm not too hooked by it. I just am off on my own little tangent in some ways. But I think I think that is like the point, right? Like, how do we engage with people to make things happen? It's sort of the big meaty piece of this book. Like, how do we do it like in a like very theoretical thought space, but also very practical, like specific moment to moment, like let's make an agenda space. Like there's model agendas in here and you're like, oh, okay, great. Like it hits all those different levels across the whole thing. I was also reading, as I was reading this, I was reading Beloved Economies. Have you read this by Jess Remington and Joanna C?
No.
It's so great. Beloved Economies is the research these two women did on what they call breakout actors, which are organizations that did amazing work, even though they seem like, oh, it's just like a community organization, like kind of smaller, maybe difficult challenges that they're facing, like neighborhood or community or city revitalization projects. Like, how do you do this type of very complex work? And so they came up with like 7 practices to make that work happen. And they're very much, here's 7 things to do in your meetings, whatever those meetings look like, whatever they mean, to move things forward. And they are practices to not do business as usual. They're basically, I think what you were just saying about like sort of the business as usual approach is, oh, we're going to have a facilitator come in, bring in all the like pieces of supremacist culture that we like normally expect, hold us to a time schedule, interrupt people, mute people, cut people off, you know, like do all these things to sort of maintain an agenda. And then we'll have Robert's Rules of Order vote, and then we're going to be done, you know, and like they kind of, the Beloved Economies, I think, more aligns with holding change in terms of, well, wait, like what actually happens when it goes well? Like what are the pieces that really are meaningful and make this happen versus we need an agenda that never wavers, which is usually not the solution. I mean, sometimes you need an agenda that, you know, to be held to time, but in reality, you need relationship and you need people to have trust with each other in order to do amazing work. So how do you actually do that in order to have these amazing outcomes, whatever it is you're working on, solutions, anything happen down the road?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the whole agenda thing is really interesting because when she's talking about that and giving the example agenda, she's like, you know, make it spacious enough that you can invite the conversation, that you make space for trust building, that you make space to check if there's like a breakdown in trust. And it's one of the things that I find really challenging as a facilitator sometimes is preparing an agenda for a client, like for, let's say for a 2 or 3 day program. And it's like, I know based on my experience that what happens on day 3 is very much based on what actually takes place on day 2. And it's also like, we need to create some structure and container. So folks are like, okay, here's where we're headed, but the way it looks when we get there is probably going to be really different. I feel like that's one of those pieces of balance to hold. And I recently told a client, like, if I had come to you and said, actually, day 3 is totally up in the air, we're just going to see what happens, you would have been like, we're going to go with someone else.
Right.
But at the same time, like that timekeeping thing can actually undermine the process. I think that's like where we end up both as facilitators being really frustrated, and then the client or the community that we're working with being really frustrated because they're like, well, we didn't get to the harder stuff, but we kept to the agenda. So great, we checked that box, but that wasn't the purpose of the facilitation, right? If someone's actually bringing in a facilitator and taking the time, one, to brief someone external on what's going on, or even if it's an internal person getting prepared. And then 2, like that time, that, expenditure, all of that, it's because they want an outcome that they don't feel they can achieve on their own, or they don't feel they can achieve without that specific role designated to someone. And so it's like the agenda piece becomes this really weird manifestation of that, like that sort of power over model of facilitation. Like, we're going to do this and we're going to do this and we're going to do this, when really it's like power with, which is Brene Brown's language. But I think I think it's her language. She's the person I've heard use that phrase the most often, power over and power with.
That's big in the restorative justice circles too. That's where they talk about power over and power with a lot. Yeah,
totally. Yes, that tracks. So actually, I don't know where it comes from. I just know I've heard it a lot. And I think that's super interesting too. This dance that we're doing, that they talk about in the book, of how to hold both the structure of the conversation, but also like make sure it's enough structure that you can move. It's like you're trying to structure a dance floor, right? And if the dance floor is too big, then nobody will dance because it's scary and like you're too exposed. But if it's too small, then you can't even move. It's like too constrained and nobody can do anything. You can't actually show off any cool dance moves. And so it's like, we're trying to like strike that balance of just the right scale of the dance floor.
There's this other great line. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm going to give you this line that supports what you are just saying. We especially can't fix a problem that everyone tells us about privately, but no one will mention in the actual meeting. And people don't mention that thing maybe until the actual meeting anyway. And you're like, ugh, this is the real thing. This is the real thing. I don't know if you've had this experience where people come to you like, hey, we need this thing solved. And you're like, no problem. We can figure that out. Here's my agenda. And they're like, yeah. Then you get there and you're like, oh, the real thing is kind of a little different piece. Like, yeah, we're going to throw day 3 in the trash because we actually learned more that we need to deal with this whole time. Anyway, carry on.
No, I love that point, but I like say that with exhaustion because sometimes, sometimes the real thing doesn't even come out until the very end. And that always to me feels, and I don't know if this is accurate or not, but it feels like a failure of facilitation on my part. Like if I wasn't able to get that real thing to surface until the very end, I get frustrated. And then the flip side is I remind myself of this phenomenon I learned about in the social work school in undergrad, where they called it the hand on the door phenomenon. Like someone, in a very classic therapeutic setting would have their hand on the doorknob to leave their appointment and mention the real big issue or like something huge that could have taken the entire appointment to talk through and is really important. But they've said it at a time when they know there's no time to deal with it because that is on some level psychologically safe for them. It's like, I can drop this and I can move away. And like, sometimes that'll happen with a group where you don't get to the real thing until really late. And people don't do this intentionally, but they're doing it because they didn't necessarily feel safe enough to do it at a time when we actually could tackle the question or the problem or the issue. And so they share it when it's like, I'm just going to say this, but we can't actually address it. So Um, and
Mm-hmm.
that is a heartbreaking one because
Mm-hmm.
what that means is like we didn't achieve the level of trust for them to bring it up in the course of the session so that we could deal with it. It's, I think, natural in a way for the phenomenon that you described, right? Where the real stuff comes out when you're in person because people are like, oh, well, you're really here. And now I feel like I can relate to you as a facilitator differently and to these folks differently. We're probably in a new space. Um, but I always hope that we can get to that soon enough to do something with it.
Right.
Like maybe we
Right.
don't solve, quote unquote, whatever's being brought up, but like at least to find some forward movement.
Yeah. I think addressing things is half of our job, and then solving things is on the group fundamentally.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So the thing I was really excited to say is probably way less,
It's going to
actually
be
way
amazing.
less
I'm on the edge
insightful.
of my seat.
But I had this aha moment looking at my notes on this book, especially about the section on Black feminist wisdom, where I thought Adrienne Maree Brown structured this like a facilitator. She didn't come into the room and say, or into the book per se, and tell us everything she knows about facilitation and mediation. She instead gathered a group and brought all their voices into the conversation. And everyone, like in this group, right, of the people who wrote the chapters in that section of the book, it felt to me like she was drawing out the voices that needed to be heard, that needed and like deserved and would, and like the field would benefit from hearing. And then she goes into like adding what value she has to add and giving it some structure and perspective, to reinforce what they said. And I thought, gosh, that is some really meta, high level facilitation work, doing that in a book where
Mm-hmm.
usually you do that in a room full of people. And I have no idea if that's actually the model that she had in mind. But she's really brilliant. So it's, I wouldn't be too surprised if she was like, yes, exactly. That's what we were doing.
Yeah, that was the
But it didn't
plan.
even,
Way to catch on. Ugh, we're like, oh, we got
yeah,
it. A little late. Yeah.
I know. It only took me a couple years.
Well, I think that's interesting because one of the things that I took, one of the lines that keeps coming back through my head from this book is how to be in right relationship. That idea of like right
Mm,
relationship comes up in a couple of those different essays of Black feminist wisdom and sort of, trickles throughout the rest. I'm like, oh, that's like right relationship doesn't mean high five, we're all hugs and, the whole time. Nor does it mean this sort of like antagonist, but we're okay because we're, on different sides. We have our lawyers to hold us back or whatever. Like right relationship is really much more complicated. And I think that's actually what the Black feminist wisdom section does. It gets us in the frame of being in right relationship with the rest of the content that she delivers later in the book, which is a little
mm,
more specific and this style, kind of
mhm.
more, I guess, more laid out in a step by step. Not exactly, but like kind of the vibe is a little more step by step later versus here's
Yeah.
this expansive relationship building section. So yeah, maybe so. That's a great perspective on this.
I also really loved in the theme of like bringing in voices and getting in right relationship. I really loved the chapter by Alexis Pauline Gumbs where she's talking about breathing um, and talking about like how we use breath in facilitation. She describes this one practice that she does where she thinks about facilitation as like shared breath and energy. And she says, I often ask folks to verbally dedicate their participation to someone who's not in the room, um, but who's part of the reason that brought them into the room. And I thought, man, that's so brilliant to be able to bring people in that way and connect it to the presence of those who are there, like, and paying attention, right? When I say presence, not just like physically showing up, but definitely physically showing up. And also like your full awareness of who you are and why you're here, and then those who are not here and how we want to represent them. Because I feel like this is often a tension we're trying to work with in facilitation too, is like not only how do we bring in all the voices in the room in a way that serves the purpose and serves the group, but how do we really actively bring in the voices of people who can't be here, who either weren't invited, weren't included, or were just unable to make it, right? Or for whatever reason, like can't participate in this way at this time. And that feels to me like also connected to this idea of voice and right relationship. Like, are we in right relationship, not only with those who are here and with the facilitation practice, but also with those who are the reason we're here, or the thing that brought us here. And it makes me think what you were saying, makes me think about what you were saying earlier, Iggy, about like, I don't feel like my work is this grandiose movement work, like I'm doing this work with small teams, and maybe that, or maybe sometimes large teams, and maybe that, ripples out or is a practice that then we then replicate in the world. And I think it's not only us as facilitators who sometimes feel like, oh, it's just this meeting. I think people often feel that. So like, how can we connect to both the people outside the gathering, but also like the bigger purpose? And I think sometimes that gets really ephemeral. Like, it's really like, oh, the bigger purpose is at like, 30,000 feet, to use a really corporate term. And here we are down, on the ground trying to operationalize. And that's really like uninspiring. But what's more inspiring is this idea of fractals that she talks about in emergent strategy and in holding change, of like, what we do here can be a model for what we do out in the world, and they're connected. And that's powerful stuff. I think for me, the thing that brings me into facilitation is the experience I've had that this is going to sound very like on the edge of things, but I think it's a way that we really tap into human magic, or human, like the thing that makes humanity really special and connected. If you don't like the word magic, we can do that through facilitation. It's like one medium that we can access that connection. Maybe connection is a better word than magic. But to me, there's a lot of power in that. And holding change kind of encourages me to lean into that power, instead of like doing, as I often do, as you described, like questioning how much, impact can this one conversation have? And instead I feel like through this whole book, it's like the answer to that question is huge impact. Let's pay attention to how we're doing it. Let's do it well. Here's some of the best practices and some of the best wisdom. And it's in a really short book, so you can digest it.
In nice little short chapters. Yeah, exactly.
Totally.
Well, I do unfortunately need to wrap up this conversation with you today, Jayne. It's been so awesome. And yeah, I think we should not underestimate the power we have in those smaller moments and smaller conversations. Even if we're not formal facilitators, doing a formal mediation, I think we are all called at different points to make things easier for other people, or help bridge gaps between folks, or help make communication flow more easily. I think if we do that well, the fractal version of it, I think, is really important and really powerful. And that is the impact we can have on the world around us and the lives of people nearby, which, it's kind of big. It's kind of huge when we start thinking of our work, anyone's actions or interactions as impacting the world around them. We all have a lot of potential, for sure, for amazing work there. So thanks so much for coming. It's been so awesome having you chat about this book with me. I really appreciate you for coming in and joining me for the conversation today.
Thanks for the invitation. I think you just said it all really beautifully there at the end. So thanks, Iggy.
Thanks, Jayne. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Books Applied podcast. I hope you enjoyed getting to know a new book and learning how to apply its ideas to make your work, sport, or life a little bit more awesome. For more leadership education-related content, including conflict management checklists, invitations to a fun free lunch that happens monthly, upcoming classes, webinars, and mastermind groups, please head over to wslleadership.com. Thanks, and have a great day.